Welcome to Peacemakers, an interview-style podcast where you'll hear and learn from world changers, ministry leaders, creatives, and many others who are influencing change and bringing peace to those around them. We're so excited that you're tuning in. Here's your host, Jonathan Moya.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Peacemakers. I'm super excited about today's conversation. Today's guest is Gena Thomas. Gena is a writer and a speaker, and she works in the nonprofit sector helping empower others through holistic development. Gena has served as a missionary in northern Mexico. She holds a master's degree in international development from Eastern University and is the author of 2 books, A Smoldering Wick, Igniting Missions Work with Sustainable Practices, and her newest book, Separated by the Border, A Birth Mother, a Foster Mother, and a Migrant's Child 3,000-Mile Journey. Gena lives in Chattanooga, Tennessee with her husband Andrew and their 2 children. Without further ado, let's welcome Gena Thomas. Hello, Gena. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And it's great to just be on your podcast. I admire the work that you do. So it's such a privilege for me.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be speaking with you today. I'm so glad that you get to share with us and with our listeners. I am just excited to hear more about your story, your new book, and I think most importantly, just have a conversation on how we can respond to a topic that is very difficult for many people to have within the church. But I think a conversation that's so relevant to the work that we are both currently tackling. Before we kind of dive into, that bigger part of the conversation, ask some questions and kind of get to know you a little bit. So before we dive into your work as a writer and a part of your story, talk to me a little bit about how growing up was for you. Tell me maybe about your parents. How was your upbringing like?
Yeah, I love that you start there. I was born in upstate New York in a small town, not in New York City. So on the western side of New York. And I grew up a lot around my Italian family. My mother is Italian.
Okay.
Her parents came to the U.S. when she was prior to her being born. And so her father started a pizzeria in this town. And so I grew up in the town of my grandfather's pizzeria. And so, so it was definitely very interesting in that not only with all the influence there of culture and, eating good food all the time. My grandmother cooked us meals a lot and her food was so delicious.
Oh, I can
unlike
imagine.
Mine. But also just because my extended family is Catholic and my mother, prior to me being born, had decided to become evangelical. And so as far as spiritual formation goes, it was a very interesting thing. Now, looking back on it, I mean, at the time, you don't really know what you're growing up in, but looking back on it now to just kind of realize the different influences that have kind of brought me to the place that I'm currently at. So
that is important. I am a huge believer, and I think, it just kind of proves through more stories that I listen to and learn about people that the way that we were influenced, in our upbringing definitely plays a huge factor into who we are, into the projects that we're tackling, into the work that matters to us. And so you kind of hinted a little bit about this. So what does life currently look like for you now in Chattanooga?
Yeah, well, my family and I recently moved here, so we haven't quite been here a year.
Okay.
We were living near Charlotte, North Carolina for a long time prior to this. And so this is kind of a new phase of life. We're no longer foster parents, at least for now. So that's its own newness. Yeah, it's a lot of focusing on, our kids and how they're doing and how they're handling the move and how school's going for them. And we have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. And then, focusing on my work, which brought us here with a nonprofit. And so I get to travel some with that. And then, of course, also with the book, I get to travel a little bit too. So it's a really very different phase of life, because prior to this, when we were living in North Carolina, prior to becoming foster parents, we were on welfare. And so travel was not something that we got to do. And so it's interesting just now, in this new phase to just really be very aware of the privilege that I have to even go to conferences and to even, travel and not have to pay for every single thing, because it's part of my job. And
Totally.
so, I think I'm uber sensitive to some of that stuff, and maybe not all of that is good sensitivity, but I think a good portion of it is very healthy to recognize that, a lot of these places where the deep theological conversations are happening, or even the practical conversations are happening, we're leaving out giant groups of people who never even get to come to the table.
There's so much to unpack there. My mind's just kind of going all over the place. Tell me a little bit more about just like, what is a day-to-day like for you? Because you mentioned that you're going and talking at conferences, you're speaking in places, and that maybe is something new that you're learning to tackle and go about every day. So bring us into what your day looks like.
Yeah, well, most days I'm here at the office, and the travel kind of comes in waves, but most of the time I'm working on, I do curriculum development, and so I'm working on curriculum with the nonprofit, and we do some work in savings groups, and we have some US-based curriculum that we work on as well. And so it really is just a lot of being more aware of what tools can equip the church to do very thoughtful and intentional, holistic development with people around them. So it's a whole new world in that of just like, I think it's easier when prior to working for an organization that equipped churches, it's easier to speak to churches kind of from afar and say, hey, white American church, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? Like, stop doing this. And it's a different level now to, I kind of brought some of that authorship into this job, but it's a different conversation. And I think a different level of understanding to really know what does it mean to speak prophetically when you do know the pain points of the churches and you do hear the difficulties that it is to raise the resources that are needed to actually make things, as ideal as we like to call them out from on Twitter, right? Like, you should be doing this and you should be doing this. And you should be doing this. Well, what about the tension of actually trying to even get to the place to do some of those things? So that's a new phase for me, and it's important work, and it's important for me to learn from this other side of things in a way that I haven't before.
Yeah.
And then as far as speaking goes, I was able this past spring to speak at a couple of different conferences, some of them seminars, and I really do enjoy that. I was a teacher when we lived in Mexico, so and it always felt the higher I got in levels, like I was teaching middle school and then I was teaching high school, I was like, yes, I can get deeper, So I really love to kind of teach seminars and just go really deep with people, with adults, and really, especially when we're talking about faith and like, how does our faith affect how we live? That's very enjoyable work to me. So
yeah, well, that's really good, which leads me to kind of my next question, because you hinted towards this. So as you've been kind of transitioning in different parts of your life, you and your husband spent some time in Mexico as a missionary couple. So talk to us a little bit about that. What was life like on the mission field? And how has being in Mexico influenced who you are today, and kind of how you are helping the current church culture think about missions?
Well, we were in Mexico for 4.5 years, and during that time, I taught English at a school that our local church, had put on. And so it was, run by the youth pastor, who's a principal, and really offered the community a deeper education than the public school did. So we did that for a while, and I kept teaching throughout our time there, but we then also started a coffee shop ministry. Essentially, there's a place right near where we lived that is called Potrero Chico, and a lot of international climbers come to climb, and then a lot of the local Mexicans don't climb. And so we tried to let our coffee shop be a place that really connected both the international rock climbing community and the local Mexican community. And we got to see some really beautiful things come of that. But what I would say about what it taught me about missions, and the whole of my thoughts can be found in my first book, A Smoldering Wick. I think one of the biggest things. And I'm really happy to hear more and more of this conversation going on where we're talking about decolonizing missions. And I think that phrase gives life to something that I think I was tapping into, but I didn't really know what to call it, and I didn't really understand it. Yeah, just really trying to push churches to really look at what are we doing, and are we actually partnering with people, or are we just saying that we're partnering, but actually colonizing? And what I mean by colonizing is not, coming in and taking over, but what I mean is, in a sense, for that week, like we would see on the other side of things that, a church that had resources and wanted to come down and do a missions group would come and really deter all of our lives for a week or 10 days. Yeah. And I would have to stop teaching classes because I would need to translate. There needed to be somebody to translate. And so, the regular flow of life was interrupted in a way that wasn't actually beneficial to the people who are there. And so I really call for people to pay more attention to this kind of stuff and to really look at what does it mean to be a partner church and to really do participatory development within our missions work rather than being people who come and say, hey, this is what we can do. This is what we're going to do. What time frame can we come? And I have this one tool that I think is very helpful for churches. It's called a typology of participation, where people can actually look at, this typology was actually created by an economics professor in England, but then I adapted it to short-term missions so that we can actually understand, are we hindering people by pretending that we're doing participation, but we're actually manipulating? And I think it's a really good tool for reflection for that reason. So, yeah.
Wow. Yes. So we will link that on our show notes. And that's something that I'm even just more intrigued to learn more about. And part of the reason why I wanted to start our conversation focusing on just this conversation of missions and the mobilization of the church is because part of our vision and part of the mission of Border Perspective is to mobilize the church. And so for most of my adult life, I think the first time I started translating for church or mission teams was when I was 15. I was forced to. My dad just, churches were coming through the border, going into Mexico. And so he said, you're not doing anything at home, so go translate. And, at that time growing up, it was just, make a little bit of money, got paid for it, met some people. And then I never anticipated that most of my adult life I was going to spend it in short-term missions. But from my early 20s till I was 30, right before starting Border Perspective, I spent it in short-term missions in all over Latin America. And by the end of my time, I was completely disillusioned with the work that I was doing. In many ways is why I left the nonprofit that I was with, because I felt that because I grew up on the border, I know the border, we were bringing teams there, but teams were just coming and in many ways just doing a painting project or a roofing project. But I think our primary focus wasn't to allow the churches that were partnering with us or that wanted to partner with us to allow them to enter into the reality and the hardships of what the communities were facing, of what the realities and the struggles are, for border communities on a day-to-day basis. And so with Border Perspective, I kind of shifted our work to be more service learning, to be educational, to be more immersive in a way that, let's tackle these big conversations. Let's tackle the big things that I think are sometimes hard for us to really dive into, but are so meaningful and important to really do healthy ministry together, cross-culturally with other people. And so I appreciate your just these brief thoughts on that. And I will definitely look at the tools that you have, even just for the work that we're currently doing and how to better that. And I'm glad that you shared some of that insight with us today about it.
And you were recently featured in Christianity Today on this very topic.
Yes, I connected with Becca McNeil, the immigration editor at Christianity Today. And so much of the work that I'm trying to do today, it is really, I'm looking at why was I disillusioned with the work that I was doing? And in many ways, why didn't I why couldn't I make the shift to what I was feeling convicted about? And I think I just needed some separation. And with Border Perspective, I'm definitely trying to just kind of figure out what are those things that I struggle with and how can I be a part of the solution in providing different avenues for us to engage in this, I think what has been a rite passage for the church, right? Short-term missions for many students and churches. And so how can we be more intentional, especially because I grew up on the border and I grew up on the receiving end, and I now kind of like, I mean, it's kind of like what you were saying earlier. Now we find ourselves on the other end, right? Where we're kind of helping advance the conversation and some of the topics of conversation and really the values of how to do ministry in a better context. But
I bless that work. I'm so glad you're doing that work. It's very important.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And you have traveled to the border yourself, right? With a couple of groups of leaders. Is that right?
One time. Yes, I did.
Okay. So where did you travel? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, we went to, I was with a group of kind of a mixture of people from National Immigration Forum, World Relief, and CCDA. And we went to McAllen, Texas.
Yeah.
And saw the detention facility at Port Isabel.
Yeah.
And then we were also at Ursula, the processing center. That came at a very important time for me. I was able to do that last year about this time. It was towards the end of September of last year. And it was just a couple of months after our foster daughter was reunited with her mother. Yeah. And it was in the midst of kind of writing this book. Yeah. And so to really see firsthand these places was beyond eye-opening, certainly emotionally opening, and just very, what's the word, deep human work, like to really think through what is humanity and what does the gospel say to our humanity and what does the gospel say to us when we dehumanize others.
Yes. So I grew up in the South Texas region in the Rio Grande Valley. So some of the places that you're mentioning are even some of the locations and places that we point out during some of our border journey trips, just because they're so relevant to the conversation and really take people beyond the headlines, right? And so I think it's like you're saying, when we experience it firsthand, it's you process it differently, and you have to wrestle with it differently. Yes, and because there's more emotion tied to it. Where when we're scrolling on our phones, it's just a headline, right? There's no tie to it whatsoever. So you took this trip and you went in with a more of a learning posture. And so how was this shaped and influenced by the realities that you saw on the border? And I love this quote by Mr. Rogers that talks about, once you've heard or know somebody else's reality, there's no way you can't empathize with them. And so you experienced that firsthand.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good quote. We have no more excuses, right? Once we hear stories, then we have to enter into the humanity of others. The trip was very heart-wrenching for me, because what was very likely was that my foster daughter had walked through at least the processing center. She had probably been at that particular one. You know, for me, writing a story about one girl and one family, this trip showed me that this is not just one girl and one family. I think that as a white evangelical growing up in the white evangelical church, there's this concept of righteousness that we were taught that is very individual rather than justice, which is more communal. And I think it's easy for us, especially because of that theology, to kind of hold up a story and say, oh yeah, that's horrible for that one person, and then kind of end the statement there, rather than recognizing that this is not just one person, that this is a systemic issue, that dehumanization is something that we are funding with our taxes, that we don't ever have to interact with this underbelly of what our nation is, but it is there, and we need to recognize it for what it is.
Yeah.
And really that, a lot of these dehumanizing practices have been going on for a very long time. It's not just the Trump administration, even though there's plenty to say about that. But it's not just that this is something that's been going on for way too long. Child separation itself has been going on for way too long, beyond zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
And every time that ICE deports someone, if they are a father or a mother and their children are being left behind, then this is child separation. Like, we have a problem in the United States with this. And when we look at our own history, we also see that problem was not just towards Latino Americans, but it was African Americans, it was Native Americans, it was Asian Americans. Like, this is not just one situation that is awful. This is the fruit of a very rotted system. And we have got to face that reality and start pushing against it, because it is not the kingdom of God.
I can imagine that for us who are deep in this type of work, when I hear the term family separation policy or different terminology like that, I completely know exactly what you're talking about. But can you explain to maybe some of our listeners who this conversation is new and they're trying to learn, what are the implications? What is the impact of such a policy? And there's some staggering stats, right? As the policy was actually active, and even now that there's still some of that happening. So walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So officially and publicly, in April of 2017, the Justice Department declared zero tolerance policy. Most news outlets did not pick it up until May. So it was about a month of it happening prior to it really being very public. And then it continued until June, officially, publicly. However, there's a lot of reports now saying that it probably started in June 2017, but it didn't go public until April of 2018. And so the situation was, the zero tolerance policy was basically, if you come across the border illegally, you will be separated from your children. The children will be held in a separate facility. And because of the Florence Agreement, which was a 1997 agreement saying that children shouldn't be held in custody for longer than 20 days. So that's why they separated, so that they could process the adults quicker and move them on and keep the children and deal, because they had to by law. And so that's why you might be seeing now there has been a lot of the Trump administration really trying to push against that Flores Agreement and trying to make it null and void. There was just a recent court order that said that no, it's going to stay intact, but I imagine they'll probably try to push up against it again. So what was happening was, basically at the Ursula Processing Center where we visited, that was really like where a lot of this like ripping families apart was actually happening. And so the mothers and fathers would go into one place, and the children were processed and would go through Office of Refugee Resettlement or be processed in a child detention facility. And then part of the problem was that the administration didn't have a plan for reuniting. So nobody kept track of who belonged to who, which just is, it's almost beyond unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
Because how does that not even cross your mind, right? From the latest numbers that I know, for sure, that during that between April and June of 2018, 2,737 children were separated from their parents. There's still stuff happening now that's saying that this is still going on. Maybe not at as massively and as publicly as it was before, but it's still happening as a way to deter people to come to the United States, which really, to be very honest, like points to the fact that there really hasn't been a lot of research done on what's even the pull factor and push factor of like bringing people here.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if you really did that research and you talk to officials who know what they're talking about, migration officials, they'll explain that this is not going to be a very effective deterrent. But all that to say that very inhumane practice that really was even called out by the United Nations as inhumane continued for way too long. There was a lot of pushback publicly, which I think actually helped kind of finally get to that point in June that made the Trump administration be like, okay, this isn't going good for us. Maybe our numbers aren't doing so well here. But, I think one of the saddest things about all of that was to hear that there were some evangelicals who were saying, well, if you break the law, then this is what's going to happen. And it just seems like such a slap in the face to a God who reminds us and reveals himself to us from someone who was very much against the empire of his day, right? Mm-hmm. And, this is, again, just fruit from very bad theology that says that we always have to follow the law. Like, there are so many instances in the Bible of people not following the law in order to follow Yahweh. So it's just... I think that's probably one of the saddest things for me, that my people are not recognizing how unchristian some of these practices are.
There is so much processing and so much emotion with, I think, this difficult conversation. And most importantly, I think I relate to you because as a foster family, you've lived this firsthand. You've experienced it firsthand, and you found a mutuality with people who have been separated and were impacted by this policy. And it's in the same lines of my work. I've been traveling to the border since April, at least once a month. The realities and the hardships and the rawness of the stories are things that I like to say, well, yeah, you often heard about this in other parts of the world, but this is happening within our borders where, and that's, I think, hard for us to grasp. And so I don't want to dismiss, I think, the emotion behind it, because it's draining and it's hard and it's difficult even for me to enter into some of this dialogue, because so much of it is personal in a way that it impacts my ability to process things and to really wrestle with what are these biblical truths that I hold dear and what do they mean? And am I being the best example and stewarding them as best as I can? So I totally get where you're coming from. So now that you gave us a little bit of background and context into the family separation policy, so your book, Separated by the Border, really highlights a very important experience that you and your family walked through. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of this book?
So I believe it was September of 2017, my husband and I became foster parents. And in October, we were placed with two girls. Around February, we had, since one girl had moved to a different home, and so we had one foster daughter in our home. Mm-hmm. And our social worker knew that we had lived in Mexico and that we both spoke Spanish. And so when a little girl who only spoke Spanish was picked up by the police and brought to the social worker's office, they needed to find a place for her to stay for the weekend. And so they called us and said, this will just be the weekend. ICE is involved. That's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement, is also involved in this case. So we just need you guys to keep her, at your house for the weekend. And then on Monday, come to court. And, the handoff will then be, back from the state back to the federal government for her. And so we showed up in court on Monday and no one else did. And so it happened again the following Monday. And so we then become foster parents to this girl. And there's a million more details in the story beyond that. But basically what happened was there were a lot of miscommunication or misinformed details that we thought when she first came into our home, like a lot of foster care cases. We don't always know all the information, but when we found out that she had been separated from her mom and that her mom had since been back in Honduras for, we didn't know how long at the time, but her mom actually had just recently gotten back to Honduras. And so we were able to connect with her mom and basically realized, and the social workers as well, realized that her mom was safe and appropriate and a very loving mom, and that this girl needed to return to her family. It was a very weird situation for foster care because it wasn't normal, at the time. And in the area that we live in, it wasn't normal for something like this to happen. And so we all kind of knew, some of the stuff that was happening with the administration, but we didn't know that this was part of that. And all that we knew was that she was in a sponsorship family, which is what happens when unaccompanied minors come through in our process. They then go to a sponsorship family. So we knew that she was in a sponsorship family's home. But that sponsorship family, unlike foster families, sponsorship families don't get paid to take care of the children that come into their home. And so not that foster families get paid a lot, but they do get paid. And that is a huge difference. And I think it's worthwhile to have conversations about why that's not happening and if it should or not, because every mouth costs money, no matter what, know. I mean, there's a lot of extra economic pressure that's put on these families that really aren't spoken to. We don't speak a lot about how difficult that could be for a sponsorship family. So she was living in a home with two single moms. Both moms worked, and all the kids except for her went to school. And so there wasn't really a place for her to go during the day. Yeah. She was too young for kindergarten. So she stayed home alone. And that, led to her coming into foster care. So once she was in our home, she came into our home end of February, and we did what we could with the help of the consulate and other social workers and getting in contact with her mom to go through the foster care process, which first involves a home study. So that home study needed to be done in Honduras, and that was done through the consulate. And then the court in North Carolina has to sign off and say that this mother is appropriate and that the house is appropriate and safe and that the child should be reunified. So that court order came in May, and then it took another month for us to get the papers from the consulate for her to be able to travel back to Honduras. So if you can imagine, she didn't come up with papers to travel. Yeah. So we had to make sure that she had some kind of travel documents to be able to get back. So then in early July of 2018, my husband and I went to Honduras with her and got to see her reunited with her mom and her brothers, which was just a beautiful and wonderful experience.
I was on your website and I saw the clip that is being used to kind of market the book, and there's some images there, right, from the reunification moment. It was emotional, I think, just to even witness that. And as I've been looking through your book, there's just so many more details about that process that I think is so foreign to many of us, right? Even just like becoming a foster parent, reunification, like separation at the border, just even the policy that impacts all of those things. Why was it important for you to share this life experience through writing?
Oh, that's a good question. I process everything through writing personally. So I think even if it was never written for a public audience, I still would have written about it to process myself. It was a tough thing to write for many reasons. If you read the book, you'll find there are some very difficult portions even to read. Yeah. And it was also difficult in the sense of just recognizing who I am and the privilege that I have to even publish a book, and that part of the story is not mine. So trying really hard to allow Lupe to tell her story the way that she wanted to tell it and not kind of add more to that portion of it was really important for me. And really just even at the very beginning to get her permission to write the book, because it's so much her story. And she really wanted this to be something that would help not only other people in the States to recognize what's happening, but also to help her fellow Central Americans to recognize what might be happening if they do decide to make the journey north. She said that she knew there were certain dangers for sure. Like that was without a doubt. But the depths of those dangers were then lived out by her. And it might be that in situations where people are really trying hard to make a very difficult decision about whether to stay or to go, that maybe a story like this could help influence them and help them make a more informed decision on what to do. So that was her hope for it. So eventually the hope is that the book will be translated into Spanish, and that'd
be amazing.
Yeah, that's certainly a hope. I don't know if it'll happen. I'm trying to make that work, but I don't know exactly how to make it work beyond, what I'm trying to do. But
for sure.
But yeah, that is the hope, because ultimately this is a story for her, for Lupe, and for people who find themselves in very, very difficult scenarios where they have to make just almost an inhumane decision that is needed to be made in those moments.
In the last 2 months, I've had the same question be asked to me. What is the trauma that asylum seekers are experiencing? What are the difficult situation? And I don't think that the people asking these questions are coming at it from a negative perspective. I think there's just a huge disconnect, right? And so I found myself actually using Lupe's story and your book as a resource, because obviously I have personal experiences and things that I've witnessed and stories that I've personally heard and seen. But I'm like, well, you should pick up Gena's book, because it really graphically details just the traumatic experiences and very difficult decisions that asylum seekers and migrant families have to be faced with, right? And so as they continue their journey, and it's not easy. I think I don't know sometimes how to convey that, because if we're not witnessing it right in front of us, then we're completely disconnected, right? And so was that a surprise to you from writing, obviously, your first missions book, even though that was a tough one too, in different ways?
Yeah.
Was there anything that surprised you about writing Separated by the Border?
Yeah, actually, there were a couple of things. First of all, I didn't know. So if you've read the book or are going to read the book, I didn't know Lupe's story until after she had said yes to us writing it.
Wow.
So I did not know. I mean, I knew that she had been held by the smugglers, but I didn't know what she suffered while that was happening.
Yeah.
And I didn't know her story growing up. I did not know that. And so, again, for her to say yes to this story, I think I can't ever diminish how powerful that is, and how brave it is for someone to say yes to allowing, this story to be told in the way that it was told. So those were big surprises to me. Another big surprise was just the depth of my own doubt in my own faith that came definitely from living, our time with them together. Certainly that it was coming at that time, but then also hearing Lupe's story, writing her story, editing her story, and then sending it back to her in Spanish and making sure everything was how she wanted it. Like that process of just continually going back to a very traumatic story, trying really hard not to ask her more questions than was necessary so that I didn't add to her trauma. Yeah, just kind of going back over and over again, this whole, there's a moment where she feels like God has just completely forsaken her. And I feel it too. And I'm mad at God for forsaking her.
Yeah.
And I have to wrestle with that, and I continue to wrestle with it. It makes my faith deeper in a lot of ways, but that depth is not necessarily fun or easy or great. Like sometimes I would rather have a shallow faith, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It sounds much easier. I totally, I'm trying to relate and to just gather the emotion that I can only imagine you had to go through and continue to go through. And one of the ways that Border Perspective started was I took a 9-day border journey trip. And many people thought that traveling the border for 9 days was the tough part. Well, the processing has continued 3 years after, right? And the wrestling even continues even deeper than ever before. And as we dive deeper into things, we're realizing that some of these questions that we have don't necessarily have answers or solutions or easy ways to talk about them. So I totally get where you're coming from. And we have to be able to be hopeful and find beauty in the depthness of all of it. but sometimes it's a big struggle. So so I'm there with you.
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely.
So your book focuses on reunification and why this was so important. Why should we as Christians be advocating for family reunification, not only in cases like this, but just in general?
Why would we ever think that we shouldn't? We have been constantly, throughout the history of the United States, it feels like evangelicals are like family values, that's like one of the biggest things that we fight for. And to see how that argument is not translating to family reunification just blows my mind. How can we say that we are for family values if we're not even going to fight for families to be together? That just doesn't make sense. You can't have a family value if you don't have a family. It doesn't compute in my mind. But at the same time, like I talked about before, we have a history in this nation of doing this kind of stuff. And I think the reality is that if white middle-class families were being torn apart, we would stop everything to make sure that injustice was right, that wrong was righted. And sadly, there is white supremacy at work, even in this. And we have to really lament the ways that our Christian faith has been co-opted by white supremacy, because it is, and it continues to be. And if we don't do serious self-reflection, and if we don't ask the questions, okay, well, what if this was happening to a white family? What if this was happening, to European immigrants who are coming? And if our answer is not the same for them as it is for what is currently happening, then there is something very wrong in us that we need to repent, and we need to lament about, and we need to bring before the throne of God and say, I'm sorry, this is horrible, ugly stuff, but I need to rectify it, and I need to make it better. And really, when we talk about foster care, that is what foster care did for me in a lot of ways. Was it brought me face to face with the demons inside of me. And I'm not saying that other things don't do that, and that people can't do that if they, don't participate in foster care. But I think for me, it was one of the most tangible ways for me to recognize the depth of darkness that is inside me, but also understand that the depth of light that is also there. And I talk in my book about how the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness feel to me now a lot more like two trees that whose branches are intertwined, and the work of the kingdom is unwrapping, the two from themselves. And some of those branches are inside of us, and some of them are in, our country and our policies, even in our religious practices. But paying attention to the fact that where the kingdom of darkness is, the kingdom of light is always right there too.
Yeah, that's powerful. How can our listeners find your work and find more details about everything that you're talking about, and just go deeper into some of the principles that you're talking about?
I'm mostly on Twitter. It's Gena L. Thomas. It's Gena L. Thomas, but also my website, genathomas.com. I have a lot of different things there, some resources for people who are interested in immigration, interested in foster care, interested in missions. Those are kind of like the three areas that I write and talk about quite a bit. And then when I can, I write and speak at different places. So I'd love to connect with people.
Great. Well, thank you so much for just sharing about your book. Thank you for sharing about your story. Thank you for challenging us as the body of Christ to just know our history, understand just the biblical truths that we hold dear to. And I'm so thankful for the work that you're doing. I hope that your book will continue to inspire and open the eyes that are shut, right, to the realities of the trauma and the experiences that many of us are disconnected to. And so thank you again for sharing with us, and I'm excited to finish reading the book myself and to just continue diving into this difficult conversation.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the work that you do too. We're in this together, and I always appreciate getting to know people who are doing the tough work and, making a lot of sacrifices to do it. I appreciate what you and your family are up to. I think it's very important.
Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this conversation. You can find Gena on Twitter, and you can also check out her website at genathomas.com. And most importantly, you can order her book on Amazon today. Again, Gena, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode, and thank you for your work. If there was anything that stood out to you from this conversation, we'll post links about it in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Peacemakers. Wherever you subscribe to podcasts, go ahead and hit subscribe. Please leave us a positive review on iTunes and share this episode with your friends through Instagram stories on Spotify. And most importantly, don't forget to join us for our next exciting episode. Peacemakers podcast is made possible by Border Perspective. Border Perspective partners with ministry leaders and organizations to host conversations on social and biblical issues that help equip the church to love our neighbor the way God intended. You can also join Border Perspective on a service learning trip along the southern border. These trips are immersive, educational, and intentionally place you into the lives of immigrant leaders serving families on the South Texas and Mexico border. To learn more about how you can join Border Perspective's peacemaking mission, visit borderperspective.org.